Welcome. My name is Gautam Thapar, and I have with me Nathan Totten, who claims to be somewhat of a celebrity when it comes to doing demos at big conferences. So I actually thought I'll bring him over into the talk to add some spunk to it.
Fantastic.
So we're here to actually talk to you about the new Azure Resource Manager that we announced today in the keynote. If you got a chance to attend the keynote, you might have seen some new capabilities that this Resource Manager provides you. But in the next 50-odd minutes or so, we're going to take you through the capabilities of this new Azure Resource Manager and show you how you will end up conceptualizing, deploying, managing, and visualizing your apps in Azure going forward. Before we do that, let's kick this thing off with a demo.
Cool. All right. So we didn't want to do all slides. I know that's probably what most of you wanted to see. No? OK. There's like 1,000 people in here for everyone watching online. It's incredible. All 8 of you watching online and all 3 of you in room. All right, so anyway, let's get going. So we're going to kick this off with a demo. So hopefully today in the keynote, you saw a little bit about the Resource Manager, what it can do, this template-based deployment system that we've built. So after the keynote, I actually asked Scott Guthrie for his credit card, and for some reason, he gave it to us. So what we did is we took that and opened a bunch of Azure accounts, and we built a really, really big template to deploy a whole bunch of resources to it. So this is this Azure template, which we'll talk a lot more about throughout this talk. But we just wanted to show you kind of what we think, why this is such an exciting technology. So a really big template. We've got something like 36, 37 resources in here. And we're going to deploy this actually to all of the, this is going to be deployed to all of the data centers that Windows Azure has, so like all 8 of them. So let's go ahead and just kick that off.
Let's just go ahead and rename this to something like lots of resources.
Earthquake.
12.
What? There you go.
There you go.
So what we're doing is we're sending that template that we built, that very large template, up to the Azure Resource Manager and kicking off a deployment. So we could, of course, disconnect this computer from the internet now. Uh-oh. We're off to a good start. Oh, that's because I don't remember why. What happened? Oh, that was from our practices. Disregard that. But anyway, so it's doing an update here. So we're deploying all of these resources now to all of the data centers, all 8 of them again. So hopefully racking up a very large bill for this account. So anyway, so this is our intro demo. This is actually going to happen in about a minute. We won't actually watch it live because that would be a little bit boring. But let's now switch over and dive into to the details of Resource Manager.
Nathan actually did mention a pretty key point. We're actually instantiating upwards of 40 resources here, but it takes less than about 40 to 50 seconds to actually instantiate it. That's pretty cool. All right, so let's dive in. So what is it that we're here to talk to you about today? We're here to talk to you about how do you do cloud resource management. Resources are fundamental building blocks of a web application that you deploy in Azure. But it's rarely the case that you end up deploying one resource and that makes up for your application. In most cases, you will end up deploying your application with a bunch of resources that span across what we call as these resource providers. Typical examples, you have a website offered by an Azure website resource provider, and then you have databases coming from SQL or MySQL, and so on and so forth. So the problem that we set out to solve with the Resource Manager was to allow for you guys to be able to bring your applications as you see them into the new Azure management world, such that you're able to deploy, manage, and visualize those applications as you deem fit, and not as something that somebody else has thought is right for you, which is the case today. We have these singletons that you end up creating by calling these imperative APIs. And once you've called these imperative APIs across the board to instantiate a ton of resources, you call some more imperative APIs to configure connections between those resources. Now, if you've had any sort of experience dealing with the Azure commandlets, PowerShell commandlets, or the API directly, you can appreciate that deploying these resources and passing configuration, orchestration, and stuff is a pretty complex task. And exactly for that reason, not just us, but our competitors as well, have always been very focused around resource-centric views and resource-centric APIs. And that squarely reflects in our existing management portal as well, where what you see is all your resources stacked up and categorized in the left pane by the provider that is providing that resource. You don't have a really good way of visualizing your application as you seem fit. So that brings me to what we think will fundamentally change the way you will end up conceptualizing, deploying, managing, and visualizing your application inside of Microsoft Azure. With this new Resource Manager offering, we offer an application lifecycle container. This application lifecycle container is called the resource group, becomes your unit of management, where all your resources that constitute your app will live inside it. What we offer is a declarative solution to be able to model your entire application with its resources and interactions between them, and be able to fire and forget and have your application be spun up in Azure. What we offer is choice based on a consistent management API surface and the resource management layer, such that you could go across PowerShell, go across the portal, go across the management API, but be able to use the same concepts to be able to interact with your resources. Now, let's delve a little bit more into some of these concepts that we talked about. So what is this resource group container? So this resource group container, as the name suggests, is a lifecycle boundary for all resources that live inside it. What we offer is a very, very tight coupling between these resources that live inside this resource group. Every resource that you instantiate in Microsoft Azure going forward must live inside a resource group. What that also means is that this resource group itself somewhat becomes part of the identity of your resource that you're instantiating, which also obviates that your resource must only exist in one resource group and cannot exist in two, for example. So going back to the massive deployment that we just kicked off before the session started, what we ended up doing there was deploying a bunch of resources across 8 Azure regions. So why did we do that? So in the real world, you have scenarios where you want to enable high availability and disaster recovery of your application. And to do so, you would like to deploy the same assets across geographical boundaries. But yet, from a management persona, given that Nathan owned all those resources, he wanted to deploy it in the same lifecycle container. So what we have is the ability with the resource group to be able to span across regions. When we talk about these resources that live inside this resource group, we offer a very, very tight coupling between those resources, such that the life cycle of that resource group, or rather the resources that exist in that, is completely together as a scale unit. You end up deploying them together, you end up updating them together, you delete them together, and the status or data related to those resources inside that group is aggregated at the group level itself. From an identity standpoint, given that these resources exist in this group, in this container, they can talk to each other freely because we are exchanging configuration information between them. And finally, from a grouping standpoint, metering, usage, and billing is now rolled up at the resource group level itself. The new preview portal that we announced today in the keynote will be able to provide you curated views wherein you can see usage and billing rolled up to the resource group itself. What that really means is a lot of customers have come back to us and told us that they've used subscription as the isolation boundary to be able to say things like, how much is X department costing me versus Y department? So they actually spin up 2 subscriptions, give it to those departments, and have them spin up resources there and see what are those 2 departments costing them. No longer do you have to do that. You could probably use the same subscription and have those resources from those teams be spun up in those resource groups and use that as the isolation boundary. That's pretty cool. Now, when we talk about this tight containmentship itself, and we talk about this life cycle boundary and being able to deploy these things together, it is not that that's the only way you will be able to interact with your resources in the future. While we enable this whole resource group concept and containmentship, you can still go individually across to each resource and modify if the need be. And I'll actually take you through some of those things when we go into the demos later in the session today. So as we were designing these resource groups, one of the things that we wanted to be very deliberate about was, while there is this tight coupling that we're sort of positioning these resource groups with, we wanted to be mindful and be deliberate about how, in the real world, people are actually deploying their applications. Does it make sense for all resources to be in the same resource group and that becomes your application? Or does it make sense that your application is split across a bunch of resource groups themselves? So the question really is, how do you define which resources live in a lifecycle boundary or in this particular container? And the answer really is, it depends on you. And the reason why it depends on you is because, in some sense, it could be very persona-driven as well. Some of you belong to large companies where you have teams responsible for individual functions of an app. Now, those teams might want to deploy their own assets in their own resource groups, and then others do want to do the same. Typical example, in a large organization, you might have a web admin wanting to deploy all his websites in his own resource group, and then the SQL admin wanting to deploy all his assets in its own resource group. The lifecycle of these two resource groups is completely different, but yet the web guy wants to take a dependency on the SQL guy to be able to access the databases inside it. The resource group model allows for that. Yet, if you have a smaller company or you have a single DevOps persona who's responsible for developing and then deploying and managing the lifecycle of all resources as well, you could do that too. Now, the resource group hosts all your resources and makes management easy for you.
Cool. Now for me to bring some spunk to the talk. All right, is everyone awake? All right. So Gautam took us a little bit through this concept we call resource groups, which is the application lifecycle boundary. I want to talk a little bit about how you actually do deployments to those resource groups, how you deploy and configure to those resource groups. So I mentioned a little bit earlier and showed you an Azure template. An Azure template is our declarative model-based way for actually for modeling your application. It's just a JSON file specifying things like which resources are in your application. We think that the Azure templates will evolve and be part of, or almost part of your application. In the sense, you'll store them in your source code. As you say want to add a website or a database to your application, you would update your Azure template, check it in, and actually use that as part of your application. So there's a couple key points, though, with this Azure template. The first one is repeatability. So you can imagine you build up a template. You've built up your application. It's got some resources in it. You're basically testing your application out. You can use your Azure template with a particular configuration, say in a dev environment with one web server, a small database. You could deploy that template to basically prop up your dev environment with a dev configuration. If you wanted to repeat that deployment, get an exact same deployment with a different configuration, an exact same model of your application with a different configuration, you could use that same Azure template to deploy to, say, your staging environment with, say, maybe more web servers, a larger database, and then use that same template again to deploy to production. In addition to deploying for different environments, you could imagine how you could use that template to, say, deploy your application to different data centers around the world. So a lot of flexibility there, but enabling, again, the key point there is enabling repeatability of your deployments. The last key point on this slide for Azure templates is updatability. So we don't think of resource groups as just a one-time, resource groups in Azure templates as a one-time use thing. We don't think of them as a one-time use entity. So an Azure template is both what you use to create and instantiate your infrastructure, but also what you use to do post-instantiation configuration. So for example, if I deployed, say, a simple website database server to one data center, later I wanted to, say, add another website that for some reason was, or for whatever reason was using that database, I could update my existing Azure template, say add some firewall rules to my database server, and then do an update operation on those running resources and have that configuration change. So not just initial deployments of your infrastructure, but actually updates to that infrastructure. Finally, we wanted resource groups and Azure templates to bring a lot of extensibility into your application. So what I mean by that is, I guess the goal here is we don't want it just to be, again, a deployment and a configuration update operation. We want you to be able to use your Azure templates and resource groups to go from 0 to really a production-ready application. So combining the model of your resources with the configuration of your resources, and then with extensions to actually perform actions on those resources. For example, later in the demo, we'll actually show you an extension that exists on our Microsoft Azure websites that goes and installs a web deploy package code onto a website that we've created. So again, not just the creation of the resource, but actually the creation and then even the deployment. You could imagine many examples of this extensibility, particularly once we get into virtual machines and that sort of thing, where we maybe use extensions on a virtual machine resource provider to, say, run a PowerShell DSC script to do some advanced configuration of our IaaS servers, or even run, say, a Chef or Puppet script to install antivirus software on our server, or install and configure a monitoring agent. So really, the idea is the possibilities are endless. You could imagine lots of different extensions to resources. But again, the idea is not just deployment and configuration of properties, but going from 0 to a production-ready application without manual interaction. The template contains everything you need to go the whole path.
Thanks, Nathan. And I really want to pause here for a second and reflect on what Nathan just said right now. So most of the times, you end up deploying your infrastructure. Once you've deployed your infrastructure, we do not want you to go and have any after-the-fact steps on that infrastructure to be able to configure it, and then taking it even further, deploying your own app code to that particular infrastructure that you just configured itself. So across the stack, if you look at it, right from deploying your infrastructure to configuring it, to be able to now update it, and then to be able to deploy your actual app code onto that infrastructure, we want that to be completely automatable, which basically means these Azure templates will allow for automation across the stack. So it's a fire and forget, literally from the time you actually conceptualize your application, you've built your app code, and then once you deploy, you're production ready right there. And how are we able to do that? We are able to do that because we wanted one of the fundamental goals that we were shooting for is to drive for consistency across the stack. And by consistency, I mean like several things here. So I'm actually going to take you through some of those things. If you look at this layer cake, if you may, the service management API surface that we've redesigned is consistent in that whether you are calling to instantiate a resource or update a resource or have an operation on a particular resource imperatively, which is to actually say to call the APIs, or you're wanting to do it declaratively, you are in fact working on the same object, the same concepts apply in both places. You don't have to learn two different things to be able to go between declarative versus imperative. Anything that is available imperatively can also be modeled declaratively. And then, of course, this means that across the board, you can choose the client of your own choice, which is to say, go from the preview portal, go from the PowerShell commandlets, or the API itself. You're interacting with your resources in the exact same manner. Taking it a step further, from the management layer itself, it is our desire and our intent to take this management layer and ship it in the public cloud and in the private cloud, as well as the hosted cloud in the future. And I'd like to get feedback from you guys on that as well, because we definitely think there's a lot of benefits there. And to sort of think about those, let's say you have a script that you've written up that is calling a bunch of APIs tuned towards the public cloud. It would be great if you could actually take that script and also apply it to your private cloud or the hosted cloud itself. And same goes for the Azure templates that you've authored as well. Let's say in both the public, private, or the hosted cloud, if you had the same set of providers, you've written a template that instantiates your app in one place, you're able to replay that in any other place, and you get the same result. I think that's really powerful, and we really want to go down that route and make that happen. Would love to hear feedback from you after the session and see what you guys have to think about that. And then thirdly, consistency at this resource provider layer, if you may. From a flexibility standpoint, we wanted to get to a point where not just first-party Azure services, but even third-party services that wish to expose any resources on Azure are able to provide those resources to the same contract in the same way that feels naturally to you, and you don't have to learn new concepts to actually go and deploy those resources. By that, I really mean, if you were in the keynote session today, Bill talked about a company called SuccessBricks, which offers MySQL databases to customers in Azure. Now, that particular service is built to the same protocol or the contract that the websites guys have built itself. So as a user of the platform, what that means is you don't see different concepts coming from first-party providers as opposed to third-party providers. It's an extremely consistent way that you call those services and instantiate resources across them. You can conceptualize your app now spanning from first-party to third-party providers without having to worry about learning new concepts. So what is the implication of all that we've talked about right now? What you end up with is this application lifecycle container called the resource group, which ends up being your unit of management. It's a much more natural way for you to sort of conceptualize and view your applications. You bring your application as you see fit into the platform, and you're able to view it just like that and manage it just like that. What we are able to offer you is a declarative solution on top of imperative APIs, which goes seamlessly side by side, such that you can actually deploy your application in a repeated fashion to get different instantiations of it. Nathan touched on that point a little bit earlier as well. You could take your definition of your application, apply X configuration to get your beta environment, Y to get your test environment, Z to get your dev environment or your prod environment. It's as easy as that. And then to be able to go and deploy your actual app code from the deployment template itself, I think that's extremely powerful. And then finally, the choice to be able to pick whether you want to choose one tool or the other, yet not having to learn any new concepts. We will provide a consistent API layer where whether you decide to go imperative or you decide to go declarative, same concepts apply. And by that, I actually want to take you through some of the demos and show you that consistency and prove to you the promise of openness, flexibility, and choice that we want to offer in Microsoft Azure. All right, how about we do some demos and see how all this stuff works? Let me switch to a different machine now. What I'm going to do right now is actually take you through a journey of deploying a web application that starts with creating a SQL server and a SQL database from the API directly. And I'll show you how you actually do that, what are the properties of each one of these resources that you're instantiating. We'll take it from that, and then we'll go across clients and keep adding to that particular resource group, and finally see how you can actually see your production-ready application deployed and working. So let's start with this tool called the Postman. What I'm doing in this particular tool is going against the new service management API surface. If you see the URI right here, it's https://management.azure.com. We've wanted to be very, very consistent and restful in the way we expose our APIs. What that basically means is, from a user standpoint, the APIs will look very, very logical and seem very, very natural. So you have an endpoint called management.azure.com, and then you're talking about a subscription, which is essentially your identity in Azure, and then you're saying, in that subscription, I want to create a resource group, and in that resource group, I want to go and create more resources. How that looks to the user is, let me send this command over the wire. What I'm doing is I'm trying to get the resource groups that are deployed in this in my subscription at this moment. And what I got back is a lot of resources. This was the resource group that I created in the beginning of the session, where we instantiated a bunch of resources across those 8 Azure regions. Now, let's take the same URI, and now I've added build 2014 demo, and let's say 14 to this particular URI. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put to this particular URI and instantiate a net new resource group. I want to take your attention to the body of this particular this API that I'm going to try to hit. JSON is what we will be using across the board to be able to instantiate these resources and define the properties of those resources. So let me send this over to the resource manager. What happens is I get 201 created, succeeded. I have 2 resource groups now. Let's go and check on that. I go and do a get again on that API, and I get 2 resource groups back. One is the build 2014 demo 14 that I created, and the previous one, which was a lot of resources. Let's take it a step further. Let's try to put a SQL server in this particular resource group. Again, taking your attention back to the URI, you have management, you have the endpoint, you have the subscription, you have the resource group that we talked about, which was, I believe, 14. And then providers. All I'm trying to do in this URI is basically saying, in this particular resource group that we instantiated, let's go ahead and create a SQL server, which is named build 2014 demo server, let's say 16. Taking your attention back to the body of this particular API, we're specifying the location of this resource that we will instantiate, which is West US, and then particular attention on the properties envelope. This envelope essentially defines the entities or the user inputs that I need to be able to instantiate the SQL server successfully. How about I actually send this over to the resource manager now? So I sent this over. What's happening at this point is the resource manager gets this call, tries to figure out the endpoint for the SQL Azure service in West US, and present that particular API with present that particular call to that particular endpoint, so that SQL Azure server can be instantiated in West US. So once we get the status back, what you see is this SQL Azure server was just created in West US successfully. Taking a step further, I'll create a SQL database in that particular resource, a SQL Azure database on that SQL Azure server. Let's just paste the name of the server, keep the name of the database as 2014 demo. Again, going back to the body of this particular call, I have properties that define the SQL Azure database. I will go and send this over. And something didn't, resource group. I didn't change the name of the resource group. So we had demo 16, I believe. I'll just do a quick get on the resource groups to confirm that. Oh, it was demo 14. All right, so change that to demo 14 right here. And then change it to the name of the SQL server and send it over. And what happens here is the SQL database is created in this resource group on that SQL server that we just talked about. Now, again, from an API standpoint, we want it to be very, very RESTful in the way we actually model the APIs, so that it becomes very natural for you to actually create these resources. Just showing you another API, this API essentially says, in the subscription scope, tell me all the resources that exist. So I'll just go send this over, and you get a list of all resources that are instantiated in this resource, in this subscription, in all resource groups. This is the one that we used in the lot of resources resource group as well, that we instantiated in the beginning of the session, and the one that we just created. Now let's go back into the management portal. And then try to browse for these resource groups. What I see is 2 resource groups, again, as expected. The lots of resources group that I created in the beginning with a bunch of resources, and the build 2014 resource group that we just instantiated. Now, how about we take this resource group, Nathan, and then try to deploy more resources to it from the portal itself?
Great. So Gautam was supposed to name all of these things consistently to make the next parts of my demo easy, but I noticed that he chose random numbers, so we'll see how this goes. He's liking to mix things up. I'm also listening to music in the back. Hopefully no one else can hear that. It's very awkward. So anywho, are you guys having fun? Everyone's really quiet. Woo! All right, good. It makes me uncomfortable if you guys are just like, I need some response. Like, make me feel like I'm doing a good job. No,
Make me feel like you
All
have
right.
some spunk.
Like, yeah, see, I'm supposed to bring the spunk to this talk, people. All right, enough of my stand-up routine. So, let's talk about the new portal. So, Gotham created some resources using the API directly. In the spirit of consistency, I want to actually run us through creating some simple stuff, or one simple thing actually through the portal. And the point here of this demo, it's quite simple, but the point really is again to show the consistency across layers. We're not doing anything fancy, anything special in our brand new management portal that we're very proud of it, but we're not doing anything special from an API layer that you can't do on the APIs yourself or from PowerShell. So one of the first things you'll notice here, just a sort of pit stop, is our new gallery. One of the really cool things about this new gallery is we've actually brought together, not only from a UI standpoint, we've brought together all of the things you can create in Windows Azure from our third-party store providers, as mentioned, ClearDB, also our community web applications, and eventually virtual machines, everything else in Windows Azure. But the really cool thing from a developer perspective is all of the items in our gallery are now backed by these Azure templates. So everything you create in the portal, you could also create in the exact same way through PowerShell or through the API directly. So I'm going to create one of these gallery items, just a simple website, again using that underlying Azure template, and I'm going to add that to the resource group that Gotham created. So let's call this My Build Demo 2014. So this is just the DNS name, the name of the website, which you're all quite familiar with at this point. Leaving the hosting plan, actually let's choose a new hosting plan. This is a new feature. We have, we should probably choose a free one since we've already racked up quite a bill on this account. So let's choose a free hosting plan. And let's call this My Build Plan. Click OK. Great. So we've got we've got a new plan, a new website that we've set the settings for, and now I'm going to go ahead and choose a resource group. So as we've mentioned, the resource group is this lifecycle container for my application. I could of course create a new resource group for this website, or selecting an existing resource group. I'm going to select the Build 2014 Demo 14 that Gotham created. Everyone remember that for later. That Gotham created, and we're going to actually add that website using an Azure template in the backend, add that website to the existing resource group that Gotham created earlier, again, through the APIs. Select that. We're going to leave our subscription on our demo subscription and West US and click Create. So again, basically what that Create Wizard was doing was gathering up parameters to be used in that Azure template, and then we're executing that deployment with the resource management API. So doing nothing that you can't do from PowerShell or through the APIs directly. This is going to take a couple seconds to create. And one thing I just wanted to point out that I actually think is really cool is our notifications. Now, in the spirit of sort of uniformity and consistency, we've actually gone and, because everything is going through this resource management API, you'll actually see notifications now in the portal for actions you take outside of the portal. So if you execute a deployment using a template, you would actually see that notification in the portal, and you'll actually see what is this? 30 minutes ago. Oh, that was our failed deployment earlier. You also notice that there's a couple other failed deployments. Gotham is still learning how to use the API that he's in charge of building. So, but yeah, I think that's pretty cool that you'll see notifications. You'll see notifications amongst other things, both outside of the portal and in the portal. So I think that's pretty cool. So now we have where's my SQL database? Oh, okay. So now what happened? Oh, okay. Anywho, where's the database you created?
The server's right here. That's okay. Right.
Oh, okay.
That's all right. That's
the
fine.
database is there. Anyway, so you did it wrong. I don't know. So anyway, so what we've done is we've added a new website and a new hosting plan to the resource group that Gotham created through the API. So again, in the spirit of consistency. So all right. So yeah. So let's go ahead now and. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Let's browse to the website. So. Browse to the website. This is just an empty website. We're going to use this later to do some more cool things. So let's go over to So what actually, now that we have our website and our database server and our database and our hosting plan, everything set up, what I want to actually do is deploy some code to this. So switching from the portal now, we're going to go back to using the APIs actually through PowerShell, and we're going to use an Azure template that we created earlier to actually manage, essentially deploy to this web application. Let's switch over to PowerShell. You see actually all the stuff we've created earlier. Actually, quick really before we go to the next thing, another thing I want to just show you is, again, everything is consistent. We've actually exposed all of the gallery through PowerShell as well, through a single API. So no longer do you have to query for virtual machines to be created, for web apps to be created, for resource to be created. You can actually query in a single place to get everything. So let's just do that really quick. Get Azure resource group gallery templates. So we can actually query the gallery just as we saw from the portal. So the cool thing about this from a developer is you could actually go, we have a commandlet here, and you could, of course, do this manually. You could actually go and download the Azure template that we use to back all of those gallery items. So say you wanted to deploy a custom WordPress site, you could actually go and download, let's just go ahead and do that, identity, download, say, this WordPress template through the command line, and you'll get a JSON file that actually is the same Azure template we use in the portal to create that. So again, a lot of repeatability. You can use that to customize, etc. So like I mentioned earlier, we've actually already gone and created a template for our demo that I want to open up. So let me just go ahead and open that up in Visual Studio, and it is called I Love Azure, of course. So opening this up in Visual Studio 2013. So I don't know if you actually had a chance to see yesterday the newest update, update 2 RC or whatever, of Visual Studio 2013. One of the really cool things that was actually included in that is a full-featured JSON editor. So you get things like syntax highlighting, formatting, etc., which has never been done in an IDE before. No one? Okay. So no. All right.
It's a first.
Yeah, geez. All right. So anyway, but there is actually one really cool thing that I do think is pretty unique. So we actually have IntelliSense in our JSON editor here. So what you actually see here, we're referencing a JSON schema using this schema notation. And this is the standards. I don't remember what the standard's called. JSON schema, probably. But this is a standard-based JSON schema thing. And what we've done is we've created a schema for the Azure template and all of the resources that go along with those templates. So what you can do is, while you type, you actually get rich Visual Studio IntelliSense. So this is all over the place. This is for property or variable names, various settings like types, things like that. Also, again, into the resource layer. So we think this will make it a lot easier for you to actually build and edit these templates yourselves. So let's go ahead and yay. Wait, you're the one who wrote the thing. No.
That's why he's clapping.
That's why he's clapping. Anywho, so before we go and actually execute this template and deploy to our website that we've created, let's dive a little bit into the specifics of what is contained inside of an Azure template.
All right. So if you look at the template itself, the template has its own domain-specific language, but it's pretty much all of it is JSON, right? So we have 3 main sections of a particular template. The first section is the parameter section. This is the section where you will have the template author go and basically model the fact that he needs some inputs from the user to instantiate things. If you look at the stuff that Nathan is showing you right now, typical examples of things that are parameterized would be things like the name, the location, and so on and so forth. So in this particular template that we're using, the site name happens to be of a parameter of type string. Similarly, we support other types as well, which are secure string for secrets that you want to basically pass on, things like your passwords. That also tells the resource manager that you need to trash these passwords once you've used them to instantiate the resource. We support integers, we support booleans, and we'll continue to sort of add more support as we sort of keep iterating on the platform. The other element that we actually expose as part of these parameters is the default value. Again, very as the name suggests, this is the template author basically saying, if the user of this template does not provide you a value, go ahead and use this particular value for that particular parameter. Then there is another property on this on the parameters, which is the allowed values. Again, very, very self-explanatory in this case. This is the template author saying, from a validation standpoint, this particular entity only allows for those values to be used, and you cannot use any other value in that. So if you remember the website that Nathan actually ended up instantiating in the portal itself, when he was taking those parameters from the user, they key off of the allowed values thing here, so you know which are the possible values that you can actually put and which are the ones they can actually not put there. The next section that we have in an Azure template is the resources section. This is really where the meat of your entire template and your resource group will sort of live. This is where you end up defining your resources that you need to instantiate, and then the connections or configuration that you need to sort of pass between those resources. So as an example, the one that Nathan is highlighting right now is the SQL Server that we are trying to instantiate here, and I want you to take your attention back to the properties envelope. You can call me cynical, but I really want to show you the consistency that we are driving for across the stack, whether it's imperative or it's declarative. The same properties envelope that we use to instantiate the SQL Server imperatively is the same properties envelope that you end up seeing here as well. So what that really means is, from a user standpoint, the only difference that we have in this instance of that properties envelope as opposed to the previous one is that we have stuff parameterized here. And parameterized means we need inputs from the user to actually populate the values of that particular entity. Then, Nathan, why don't you take us to the website's resource, and we can actually look at how we are passing in some, right there. So let's just go down. So we have, let's go to the websites thing and try to see how we're passing in the connection string.
We rehearsed my zooming all morning.
Right here. OK, so what we're doing here, if you look at it, is this is the MS deploy extension that we are deploying.
I'll let you do it.
Now, we're deploying the MS deploy. I'm sorry. We're deploying the MS deploy extension on this website. And essentially, what I wanted to show you is things like the connection string, which is a combination of the JSON entities. Like, we are concatenating things that are coming across parameters and things that are coming across references from other resources. So a reference syntax here essentially dictates that any resource that is instantiated above in the template, maybe the server, you take one of those properties, concatenate that with another property that the user is inputting, and then basically construct the connection string when you pass it onto the website resource when instantiating it. What that means to the resource manager is when you pass this template on, the resource manager constructs a dependency graph of all resources inside and tries to figure out the most optimal way to deploy these resources, whether it does it in parallel or does it in sequence, in the sense that it needs to wait for A resource to spin up, take something out of it, and then basically pass it on to the B resource. The final section that we have in a particular template, we don't have it in this particular template, is the output section. And it's very self-explanatory again. That section contains things that you want to spit back to the user once the instantiation completes. So imagine you were deploying a WordPress blog site. If you took that template and instantiated it into a resource group, what would be output back is the DNS. And again, from a user standpoint, again, from a template author standpoint, you could choose what you want to output. And then if you're going to end up constructing your own templates, you could actually build workflows based on that, based on the things that are coming out of that template, and then feeding that as input into templates that you instantiate later on. Why don't we go ahead and deploy this template?
All right. So now we spent some time on this. So we're going to actually go ahead and deploy this template to the resource group on top of the website, hosting plan, and server that we actually already created earlier in the demo. Let me just, so you guys don't have to watch me type all of this, I'm going to go ahead and cheat a little bit. Copy this. Although I'm going to have to change things. All right, so what I'm doing here is actually, the command here is new Azure resource group. So I'm actually going to deploy to, hang on. I'm going to, again, deploy to this existing resource group, which we've called, thank you for writing them down.
Build 2014 Demo 14.
Build 20 Demo 14. All right, and I'll explain this in a second. When site name is...
Site name is My Build Demo 2014.
Oh, man, we really dropped the ball on consistency. My build, apologize for this. My build demo 2014. 2014, and the database name.
I didn't write that. Yeah. That's okay, you can leave it that way.
Server name is.
I did not write that.
Oh,
you can actually go back into the. Let's do it again.
Get. What? Which one?
Get SQL servers.
Oh, this one.
Send.
So we're using our wonderful API here.
No, just get resources.
Oh, I did get SQL database. Hang on.
You're putting a SQL server.
Oops. Well, now we got 2. Can never. Where? Let's do it in the portal. This is crazy. All right. This is madness. 16.
16.
This is.
We want Nathan to earn his paycheck, really, right
yes.
now.
Really? Okay. So let's build.
And Nathan, I mean, why don't you tell us why is it that you're using the same names again here?
What did I name the plan? We're losing it. All right. My build plan. All right. Now that we've recovered, hopefully. Okay. So skipping all that. Okay, so hopefully this works. So what we're doing again is we're using the same resource group that we already created, the same server we already created, the same web hosting plan and website that we've already created, and maybe a database. I don't know if did we forget to create the database?
Yeah,
okay.
we didn't, yeah.
So either way, but basically what we're going to do is I mentioned updatability earlier. So we're going to execute this template on top of those existing resources. And you can think of the resource manager as basically trying to put what's in the template in the same, put what's actually deployed in the state that the template tells it to be in, which is exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to execute this template. We're also in this template, as I mentioned, going to use one of those extensions, which in this case is the MS deploy, the web deploy extension, which is going to take our code package, this I Love Azure sample app we have, and actually deploy it to the website. So fingers crossed. Oh, yep, this was bound to happen. Site name, ruh-roh.
So anyways, while Nathan is trying to figure out what happens here, essentially what we're trying to do here is we've already deployed a bunch of resources inside that resource group. What we're trying to do is update those resources, and as long as we use the same names, it tells the resource manager that you have to go update those resources as opposed to spin up net new ones. So that's where if you would have used some consistent names, you would have probably be able to figure this out well. But yeah, if you use completely different names but apply the same template, that would result essentially in net new resources being created in that resource group. That goes back to something like when we created the first template, or we used the first template to instantiate this thing, what we ended up doing was using the same thing and deploying it again and again to different regions, just the difference being that the resources had a different name and nothing else.
So this gives us a nice opportunity to point out some of the one of the really cool features about the PowerShell script or PowerShell commandlets here is you actually get IntelliSense on the actual parameters that are in the template. So the PowerShell command that I actually specified the template file here, it actually went and looked inside of that Azure template, and it's giving me again or not IntelliSense, but tab completion of the properties inside. What?
Hit enter and it'll actually ask you things.
Oh yeah, there you go. So yeah, so it actually gave me IntelliSense. Well, I want to show one. So oh no, we lost it. Okay, so the site name. Anyway, let's hit IntelliSense, and then it's smart enough to actually go through and ask us for ones that are missing. So if there are no default values provided, we actually have to go ahead and type those in. It'll kind of ask us. So the hosting plan is my build plan. Site location is West US. The server name is
16, I believe.
What?
16.
My build.
No, build 2014 demo 16.
All right, we're going to do this one more try, and then you're just going to have to take our word for it. My demo 16. Location, West US. Database name is.
We didn't create a database.
Is my please work this time. That's probably too long. I'm probably violating some length restriction there. All right, let's give it a go.
Fingers crossed.
Oh, I forgot to do force, so yes, we're going to do yes. And all right, magic. So easy. So after a little bit of struggle, what we're doing is, again, taking that template that we created and executing it on top of the resource group that already existed. And now we're going to put that resource group with the resources in it in the state that we wanted it to, which one of the things we'll see in just a second here, hopefully, is our MS Deploy extension executing. So taking code, we actually put an MS Deploy package in Windows Azure Blob Storage, and this template's going to take that, the extension on Windows Azure websites is going to take that MS Deploy package, move it over into the extension, execute it, deploy the code to Windows Azure websites. just a little bit here. It always takes longer when demoing. This is when you're going to do your dance and song that you've prepared. No. Oh, there we go. So MS Deploy. So we're running that MS Deploy extension. Now, again, taking that code package and deploying it in Windows Azure websites. And hopefully here in just a second, we'll be able to refresh the browser. Provisioning. And done. All right. A miracle. And refresh.
Fingers crossed.
And
there you
voila.
go.
So our MS Deploy package was deployed with great ease and no awkwardness of any kind. So the next thing we were going to do, although I don't think we have time for it and I really don't want to try, is we can take that exact same template and actually set different parameters to actually deploy those same resources in different locations. So within the same resource group, we can have resources in different locations. So what we could very easily do is create a new, using the same template, execute that again, create new hosting plan, a new website, a new database server, and do that same MS deploy to create those exact same resources in say East US, giving us in just a few lines of PowerShell and one template, giving us now a globally redundant application living inside one resource group. You could imagine also where you could extend that template to add something like Traffic Manager on top of it to do load balancing across regions. So it makes repeatability very, very easy. Yeah, so with that, I think you have some
No, we just want to leave you with some of the key points that we touched during this demo. Clearly, what we're putting out with the new Azure Resource Manager is essentially a paradigm that is all about you. So this new platform is designed for you to be able to bring your own applications into Azure as you see fit, as opposed to what we've been doing up until now, where you have resource-centric views and resource-centric APIs. Then we want to be able to provide you a predictable way to actually go deploy. Pardon all the mishap that happened today, but as long as you use the same names for the resources that you've instantiated and you continue to update on that particular resource group, we will make sure that we update that particular resource group and only those resources. And efficiency specifically, that you don't have to worry about writing net new templates every single time that you have to deploy this in a different environment, if you may. You take the same definition, which is your service, or which is your application, and then apply a different config, and it just continues to work for you. And really, this is just the first step. We're just scratching the surface as you speak. In true cloud fashion, we'll continue to iterate over the platform every 3 to 6 weeks, keep adding new functionalities, and hopefully bring more value to the platform. And then finally, as I said, it is our desire to be able to take this resource manager as is and ship it both in the public cloud as well as the private cloud, so that we can enable a lot more complex scenarios like hybrid deployments, where you're deploying stuff across the private and the public cloud, or taking the same templates, deploying them in one place, and then basically taking them and replaying them in another place as well.
So I realized we actually forgot one thing. Since we deployed so many resources during this demo, we should probably go ahead and delete them. So one of the really cool things, going back to the portal here, that we've done, both cool and dangerous. So you've probably gone and deleted a bunch of resources in the vCurrent portal and know that you have to delete everything individually. You also have to delete things in the right order. If a website depends on a database, et cetera, a storage account, the virtual machine, disk, all that layer, I'm sure we've all experienced that fun. You have to delete everything in a very planned order. What we've actually done is, because the resource group is your lifecycle management, you can now delete your entire application in one, again, very convenient and also dangerous command. So again, we've spent a lot of money. We probably should clean this up. So I'm going to click delete on this resource group. Let me go over to the other one that we also have.
And a word of caution again, while it sounds very cool to be able to clean up your resource groups in one shot, you want to be very mindful that you're not actually going and deleting your production resource group and bringing an outage which makes you wake up in the middle of the night.
We are going to improve that dialogue a little bit to make it additional confirmation. It is a little bit too dangerous and easy right now. But what we've done is actually we created something like 45 resources during our demo, and in just 2 API calls, we've deleted that. So it's pretty powerful. Like if you had a continuous deployment system for your dev or test environments, you'd be able to very easily spin up and delete all your resources.
Very good. All right.
Cool.
So that's all about it from us today. We're open for questions.
Got about 5 minutes.
Maybe.
Otherwise, thank you for coming.
Go
if
for
you
it.
have any otherwise questions. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, Gautam. So yesterday they showed us the PowerShell directly inside the Azure portal,
Mm-hmm.
and the PowerShell workflow piece where you can say, I have a parallel activity, and I want to provision 2 machines. You know what I'm talking about? Yesterday, the Azure automation stuff that was announced in a session yesterday by Joe and Brady. Had a session.
I do not remember that. But if you can take me through that, maybe you can answer it.
So there's some overlap, and this is causing some confusion in my mind. I mean, they showed you can go into the Azure portal, and not the new one, but the old one.
I see.
And you can go into the Monaco editor, and you can actually, basically launch a runbook, which is such a set of PowerShell commands based on PowerShell workflow.
That is correct.
Right? Where you can say, this is the virtual machine, this is, and so on and so forth. And here you talked about, the resource manager doing this analysis of, what things can be parallelized and things like that.
That's correct.
So I need to understand, is that the old way of doing things, although it was announced yesterday, or?
That's a good question. So your question specifically is with respect to what you saw yesterday in the existing portal with respect, I think it was orchestration as a service, where you're deploying a runbook, and that runbook is being authored by you, which takes you across a bunch of PowerShell scripts and so on and so forth.
That's right.
And what we're talking about here is a much more native declarative model. So yeah, this is not new and old in any sense.
Yes.
We actually see the orchestration as a service sitting sort of on a layer even on top of us, being able to actually call these resource manager templates and being able to instantiate between them. As I mentioned to you in one of the scenarios, if you remember, the outputs from a resource manager template could be used to feed into inputs to another workflow, if you may. So that orchestration as a service runbook, if you may, you could write that, take that particular Azure template, and then instantiate it, and they take the output from that particular thing, feed it up into a different resource script, and spin up your application, if you may. So they do exist side by side, absolutely, and serve very different purposes.
So unless somebody, I have to
Go for it.
follow. But they are also running on some sort of a workflow host, and looks like you are also running on a durable host. So it seems like that was the cause. That was my question. Quickly on the JSON format, how do I, let's say you talked about that Puppet agent, but what if I wanted to insert a command like an AT?
A bash script?
Like a batch script or an AT command? Is that a JSON format for that?
So that's a good question.
And then finally, when I launch a VM, I want to be able to store some kind of a property bag on that VM, so that I can inspect it later and do some things with it. Is the JSON format support that as well?
So that's a good question again. So I'll address that for you. So again, going back to the JSON format itself, the JSON format gives you the ability to be able to model your application and then model the configuration of your application inside the resources that you instantiate. In case of a virtual machine where you're taking a chef script, if you may, what you're modeling is a way to tell the platform, I want to take this particular bash script or this specific chef agent and inject it into the platform, into the VM once it's instantiated. What that means is, from an extensibility point, the VM resource provider needs to be able to understand what to do with that particular extension that you're talking about. So in the case of where you want to inject some sort of property key value pairs, if you may, or something to that extent into the VM itself, maybe that is executed via a PowerShell script that you've written. So which means that to the VM provider, you would say, hey, spin me up a DSC agent, and then that DSC agent will actually run this particular PowerShell script, which you could host on your blob storage, and then once the VM is instantiated, the VM resource provider will be responsible for fetching that thing, passing it on to the VM, injecting it to the VM, running that particular bash script, running that PowerShell script via the DSC agent, which thereby injects your stuff into the VM itself. So it all depends on the extensibility point and the agents that you're using to actually do that. You could decide to actually inject an antivirus agent using Chef, if you may, or Puppet, if you may. So all that is completely extensible and depends on what sort of extensibility we want to offer with each resource. JSON merely gives you a way to sort of model it. Once you've modeled it, then it is for the provider to be able to take that stuff and then inject it into that resource and then provide that ability to you.
So I think we'll be around, but I think we're probably going to get cut off here. So
Okay.
we've got about 30 seconds. So I think we'll wrap it up, and we'll be available for a little while if there's any more questions. But thank you all for coming, and we'll see you afterwards.
Thank you.